Welcome back to the deep dive. If you need a shortcut to being instantly informed on the world's most high-stakes confrontations, you are in the right place. Today, we're putting our sources under the microscope to analyze a crisis that has escalated from, well, political maneuvering to a potential kinetic conflict. The dramatically increasing military tensions between the United States and Venezuela.
Right, and this is a scenario where the sheer magnitude of the deployed force demands your attention. But the stated justification for that force, it requires extreme scrutiny.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive, using all the sources you've provided, is really threefold.
First, we have to analyze the scale of this U.S. military buildup and Venezuela's defiant response. Second, we're going to rigorously scrutinize the stated rationale, this thing called Operation Southern Spear, the war on drugs, and really show where the facts diverge from the rhetoric.
And wildly diverge. Finally, we'll pinpoint the deeper geopolitical and economic drivers to assess just how imminent the risk of conflict truly is.
Okay, so let's get right into it, starting with that sheer, overwhelming presence that defines this crisis.
We are talking about a recent, and I mean unprecedented, U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean, an effort the Trump administration officially designated Operation Southern Spear. For you, the listener, understanding the scale is so crucial because it helps separate what would be a standard counter-narcotics patrol from this, a coercive expeditionary military operation.
And the scale is simply staggering. It's drawn a huge signal. And a signal of intent.
Absolutely. We're talking about nearly 4,000 sailors on board, dozens of the most advanced warplanes the U.S. Navy has, including FA-18EF Super Hornets.
And crucially, the forward is not operating alone. It's supported by a full carrier strike group. Our sources have specifically tracked Tomahawk-armed naval assets operating in exceptionally close proximity to Venezuela's coast. We're talking the destroyer USS Stockdale and the guided missile cruiser USS Gettysburg.
And they were located less than 50 kilometers from the Venezuelan mainland.
50 kilometers.
That puts Caracas and key coastal infrastructure well within the range of their missile systems. Let's clarify the legal geography here for a second, because the location is absolutely critical to the narrative. They are inside Venezuela's exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, but they are technically outside the 12 nautical mile limit that defines their territorial waters.
Right, and that distinction is paramount. Being within the EEZ, which, extends up to 200 nautical miles, it allows for freedom of navigation and military maneuvering legally.
Legally, yes.
However, operationally, that proximity means Caracas and all the military bases along the northern coast are within rapid striking distance of Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. And those can be launched from both the destroyer, the Stockdale, and the cruiser, the Gettysburg.
So we're not talking about slow surveillance ships. These are sophisticated, long-range strike platforms. They're equipped with the advanced Aegis combat system. They can go from just monitoring to precision strike almost instantaneously. This is overt coercive pressure. It's not a standard border patrol.
Exactly. And the total force deployment that's underpinning this pressure is significant. You have to include the Marines practicing beach landings and artillery training at regional staging areas, B-52 bombers arriving in the region, spy planes, and a submarine whose presence is only hinted at, but, it's assumed. The total troop count in the area has been boosted to up to 15,000 U.S. troops.
15,000.
Deployed within the Latin American area of operations. When you put that number 15,000 troops, plus the forward, into the context of a regional stabilization force, it tells a story far beyond just interdicting a few boats.
So how does President Nicolás Maduro respond? I mean, this overwhelming American military hammer shows up right off his country's shore. What does he do?
His response has been one of, highly visible defiance and rapid domestic mobilization. Maduro ordered what he termed a massive mobilization of military personnel, a civilian militia, police officers, and ruling party organizers. It was for a 2-day national readiness exercise.
And the numbers they cited were huge.
Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez cited a figure of 200,000 forces being mobilized.
200,000 forces is an enormous figure. And while, independent observers haven't verified that number, the sheer scale of the stated mobilization is clearly intended to send two powerful messages. One is of domestic control to maintain internal security, and the other is one of international resolve.
It's pure signaling. Venezuela also announced readiness exercises that were specifically designed to protect its airspace, and they're relying heavily on their Russian-supplied air defense
Yeah.
systems.
Right. They put on this highly publicized display of their mixed fighter fleet. You have the older F-16s, which are U.S. legacy aircraft, and the modern Russian Su-30 Mk-2 fighter jets.
And the public messaging from Caracas warns against an imperialist threat, with Maduro himself insisting, if they dare to touch Venezuela, they will find us here. They are signaling they are prepared for a costly fight, even if they know they can't win a conventional one.
Okay, so the stage is set for a confrontation. You have overwhelming offensive U.S. power facing a mobilized Venezuelan defense. And all of this is being justified under the banner of Operation Southern Spear.
Which brings us to the core of the U.S. narrative. We really need to rigorously scrutinize the stated rationale for this massive operation.
Right. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth launched Operation Southern Spear, and he defined its aim as dismantling narco-terrorists and securing the American homeland from drugs.
The language coming out of the administration is, it's uncompromising and explicitly aggressive. Hegseth made it clear. The mission is to defend our homeland, remove narco-terrorists from our hemisphere, and secure our homeland from the drugs that are killing our people.
And he also coupled this mission with a throwback to, 19th century foreign policy. He explicitly said, the Western Hemisphere is America's neighborhood, and we will protect it.
And the most controversial and frankly visceral element of this operation are the tactics being used, these deadly boat strikes. Our sources indicate that U.S. military forces have struck at least 21 vessels since the operation began back in September, targeting the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific corridors off Venezuela, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia.
The body count from these strikes is just shocking.
It is. Since the strikes began, there have been approximately 80 suspected smuggler fatalities in total. Only 2 survivors were repatriated to their home countries. And the pace was relentless. The sources detail how the kill rate accelerated from, say, 1 boat every week or so in early September to, at one point, 1 strike every single day in mid-October.
And the administration's justification for this lethal action has been exceptionally brutal. It seems designed to deter through extreme force. Secretary Hegseth's stark warning was delivered almost as a threat.
It was a threat, he said. If you are trafficking drugs to poison the American people, and we know you're from a designated terrorist organization, we will find you and we will kill you.
And this is where we see that immediate global pushback. You have critics labeling these actions as extrajudicial executions. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, a key regional figure, he really articulated this point strongly.
He did. He insisted that the people being killed are often just poor boatmen hired by gangsters and not the heads of the cartels. Petro's argument really hinges on the fact that these actions violate due process. He said, whether the fisherman was carrying fish or cocaine, he had not been sentenced to death.
This clash between the administration's rhetoric and the reality on the water-killing low-level transporters, it forces us to fact-check the very core of the narcotics claim. Given the magnitude of the military response, the Ford, the Tomahawks, 15,000 troops, is Venezuela truly the nexus point of the U.S. drug epidemic?
This is the massive disconnect. The data strongly challenges the narrative that Venezuela or the Caribbean are primary contributors to the current U.S. drug crisis, especially when you're talking about the most lethal drug driving the epidemic. Analyst John Walsh provided a figure that should just stop everyone cold.
What was it?
0.00% of fentanyl arriving in the U.S. comes from Venezuela, the Caribbean, or South America.
0.000%. That is an astonishing figure when you contrast it with the deployment of a nuclear aircraft carrier strike group. If fentanyl is the central element of the U.S. crisis, and Venezuela contributes none of it, what does that tell us about the true purpose of Operation Southern Spear?
It tells us the focus is geographically misaligned, or the focus is not actually about fentanyl. Illicit fentanyl is overwhelmingly manufactured in Mexico using precursor chemicals that are mostly imported from China.
So if we are fighting the fentanyl war, the carrier should be parked off the Pacific coast of Mexico.
Exactly. Furthermore, if we look at cocaine, the drug Venezuela is often associated with, the DEA's own 2020 report noted that only 8% of the cocaine arriving through the Caribbean corridor originated from Venezuela.
Only 8%.
And most of that cocaine that does transit through the Caribbean, including Venezuela, is often bound for Europe, not the United States.
So just to be clear, we are deploying one of the largest forces in decades against a problem, fentanyl, that doesn't exist in the region, and a secondary problem, cocaine, for which Venezuela is a marginal supplier relative to the Pacific routes. It sounds less like a surgical strike and more like a massive military buildup using a marginal drug problem as a flimsy cover.
And this behavior follows a very clear historical pattern that our sources emphasize. The U.S. war on drugs has a long documented history of military escalation that, ironically, often creates or strengthens the very cartels it is meant to fight.
Okay, let's detail that precedent because understanding the past failures is absolutely essential to assessing the risks today.
Well, we can trace this all the way back to President Richard Nixon in 1971. He launched the all-out offensive on drugs, which led to the creation of the DEA in '73. And this offensive quickly spiraled into overt militarization. In Mexico, for instance, sources detail that starting in 1975, U.S. agents and local forces carried out what was described by historians as a terror campaign. It involved extrajudicial murder, torture, widespread intimidation against poor peasant farmers accused of growing illicit crops.
And what was the long-term, the unintended consequence of such aggressive militarized campaigns?
The most profound and tragic consequence, as noted by historians like Greg Grandin, was that this campaign ultimately led to the concentration of illicit drug production and transport into these highly organized, hierarchically structured paramilitary organizations, the cartels we know today.
So by violently suppressing small, independent producers, the military offensive essentially created a power vacuum.
A power vacuum that only large, centrally organized and heavily armed groups could fill. The U.S. military approach to drugs literally created the enemies it is now ostensibly fighting.
It's a self-perpetuating loop of conflict. And that trend of militarization, it escalated dramatically under President Bill Clinton.
It did. It reached a new level of privatization and massive spending with Plan Colombia between 1993 and 2001. Washington channeled billions, not just into the Colombian military, but also into private military contractors. We saw corporations like DynCorp getting contracts for aerial eradication spraying chemical defoliants, and Oakley Networks managing these extensive surveillance operations, linking military tech directly to privatized field ops.
And after all that, this massive privatized effort, what were the metrics of success?
They were catastrophic failures. The net result of Plan Colombia, according to analysts, was a doubling of cocaine production.
A doubling.
A doubling. Not only did it fail to stop the drugs, but it resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, widespread displacement, and severe ecological devastation from the indiscriminate chemical spraying. The lesson here, reinforced over half a century, is that escalating the military war on drugs often achieves the complete opposite of its stated goal.
And as you mentioned, even Republican administrations like George H.W. Bush, who executed Operation Just Cause to arrest Manuel Noriega in Panama, found that suppressing smuggling in one area like the Caribbean, it just shifted the transport routes overland through Central America and Mexico, making problems there even worse.
Exactly. The current boat strikes off Venezuela seem set to follow this exact pattern, just pushing the flow further into the Pacific corridor.
That's the danger.
And today, the legal justification for even this preparation phase remains murky. Lawmakers were briefed on a secret target list inside Venezuela developed by the Pentagon, but those briefings came with a major caveat. The administration's current legal analysis only applies to the boat strikes in international waters.
So there's no clear legal justification presented to Congress for a direct strike against targets within Venezuela itself.
Not yet. So the U.S. is legally prepared to kill people on boats in international waters, but has not provided the legal basis for using those Tomahawk missiles parked 50 kilometers offshore against the Venezuelan mainland.
Which implies the actions taken now are legally distinct from the strikes being prepared for. It underscores that the current operation is purely preparatory.
Right. And if the U.S. military cannot justify this massive operation on counter-narcotics grounds, then the only conclusion you can draw is that the drivers are far, far deeper, focusing on political and economic leverage against the Maduro regime itself.
That is the pivotal realization. If Operation Southern Spear isn't really about marginal drug flows, what is it truly about? Let's transition to the underlying motivations for such a massive show of force, citing those analyst views that this deployment is geared far more toward pressuring Caracas and preparing for regime change than simple interdiction.
The sources confirm that the deployment is entirely consistent with demonstrating credible force for regime change. U.S. officials, including Defense Secretary Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane, have been briefed on updated military options for Venezuela, including options that involve kinetic action inside the country.
And what specifically are the military options on the table, according to these sources?
They range from highly targeted, maybe less likely options, like sending Special Operations Forces, SOF, to apprehend or kill President Maduro and his senior advisors, to more conventional infrastructural strikes. The conventional plans include strikes on seaports, airports, and command and control military facilities.
And what would be the objective of those conventional strikes?
Well, the immediate military objective would be to degrade Venezuela's integrated air defense and command structure. They need to ensure freedom of action for any follow-on operations, whether that's a larger invasion force or simply forcing the regime to collapse under political and economic pressure.
Right. And when President Trump was asked directly about potential land strikes inside Venezuela, his response was, well, it was telling. He was non-committal.
Very non-committal. He said, I don't tell you that. I mean, I'm not saying it's true or untrue, but he left absolutely no doubt about the political goal. He stated definitively that Maduro's days as president were numbered.
Okay, so that brings us to the immense long-term economic and political drivers influencing this White House approach. The first, and arguably the most powerful, is oil.
The lure of oil reserves is absolutely central to this conflict. Venezuela possesses the largest known oil reserves in the world, managed by the state-owned company, PDVSA. The frustration in Washington stems not just from Maduro controlling the oil, but from the fact that despite having these vast reserves, Venezuela is far from being at capacity in terms of production.
Can you quantify that potential for us?
The potential is staggering. Due to sanctions, chronic underinvestment, reliance on old infrastructure, and lack of access to key international service providers, though Chevron does have a limited sanctions exemption, Venezuela is producing only a fraction of what it could. Analysts estimate the country has the latent capacity to be producing 2 million or more barrels per day than it currently does.
2 million more barrels a day.
If those reserves were opened up and modernized under a friendly U.S.-backed government, it could fundamentally shift global energy dynamics.
So the motivation is rooted not just in current production, but in the massive potential production. President Trump's past comments explicitly link this obsession to the current strategy.
Oh, he's on record. He suggested that if the government had collapsed earlier, the U.S. would have taken it over and gotten all that oil. This kind of rhetoric makes it very difficult for the administration to frame the deployment as a purely humanitarian or counter-narcotics mission, since the economic incentive is openly acknowledged.
And beyond the lure of oil, this deployment and the accompanying rhetoric are heavily draped in geopolitical significance, specifically the clear revival of the Monroe Doctrine.
That is precisely what Latin American observers are calling it. Secretary Hegseth's insistence that the Western Hemisphere is America's neighborhood and we will protect it is a direct, clear echo of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which posited the U.S. as the region's sole arbiter, barring European interference.
Some are even calling it the Donroe Doctrine.
Exactly. A mix of the aggressive unilateral approach of the Trump administration fused with that old framework of domination.
And across Latin America, that Monroe Doctrine phrasing, it carries immense historical weight. It's almost universally viewed negatively, associating U.S. actions with historic imperialism and domination over the past 2 centuries.
And the timing of this enforcement mechanism is being driven by the growing strategic influence of China and Russia in what the U.S. traditionally considered its exclusive sphere. This is a clear manifestation of the great power competition.
Okay, let's start with China. Their influence is largely economic, but it's vast.
It is. China is Venezuela's #1 oil customer, but their regional influence extends far beyond Caracas. China is now the #1 trading partner for South America overall, with trade valued at an estimated $518 billion in 2024.
So the U.S. deployment is undeniably an attempt to push back against this increasing economic and political penetration to assert U.S. primacy.
But the Russian involvement is far more provocative, especially given the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
Right. Russia is using Venezuela as a clear, active proxy to challenge the U.S. right in its claimed neighborhood.
They have publicly confirmed shipping sophisticated air defense systems to Caracas. A high-ranking Russian lawmaker, Alexei Zurevlev, confirmed that Russian Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E systems were recently delivered via L-76 transport aircraft.
And this strategic decision by Russia has been described by some military analysts as a catastrophically dumb decision. Why such harsh condemnation?
Because Russia desperately needs those same air defense systems for its own defense.
Yeah.
They're currently being destroyed or depleted in Ukraine, and Russia needs them at home to defend critical infrastructure, especially its oil refineries, from ongoing long-range drone strikes.
So by diverting them to Venezuela, A nation Putin views as a pawn to challenge the U.S.-Russia is overtly prioritizing foreign policy signaling and geopolitical gamesmanship over protecting its most vulnerable domestic assets.
It is a profound demonstration of their commitment to the proxy war in the Caribbean.
And Zurevlev didn't stop at confirming the defensive systems. He delivered what was called a not-so-subtle threat by hinting at the future supply of offensive weapons.
That's right. He suggested that there are no international obligations restricting Russia from supplying offensive ballistic or cruise missiles. He specifically named the Oreshnik ballistic missiles and the Kalibru cruise missiles.
Which is a chilling message.
The implied message to the U.S. is chilling. If you threaten Venezuela, Russia will arm Maduro with weapons that could potentially strike targets in the U.S. homeland or nearshore assets. On top of that, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed Russia is ready to fully act within the framework of the obligations stipulated in their strategic partnership agreement with Venezuela, an agreement only ratified in late October.
Okay, finally, before we move on, we have to look at the domestic political calculus. Why escalate the specific crisis right now?
Analysts are unanimous that the timing has strong domestic appeal. The tough, aggressive stance, framed as homeland defense against drugs and hostile foreign powers, it appeals strongly to the Republican base.
And this is particularly true in Florida, a crucial swing state.
Absolutely. Florida is geographically close to Venezuela and has a very significant Latino population, including powerful diasporas from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela itself, many of whom harbor strong, decades-long anti-Maduro feelings. Leveraging this attack on Venezuela to push for regime change is a calculated way of appealing to that specific electoral base. The escalation is a convergence of oil, geopolitics, and domestic political utility.
That convergence makes this military operation far more complex and risky than the simple war on drugs narrative suggests.
Much more.
Let's pivot now to the fallout. Unilateral action of this magnitude almost always generates international isolation, and the consequences of the U.S. actions have been severe, leading to setbacks even from traditional allies.
The most immediate, severe, and potentially self-defeating blow to Operation Southern Spear is the loss of actionable intelligence from Colombia. Colombia has historically been the U.S.'s staunchest ally in the war on drugs.
But not anymore.
No. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who was himself recently sanctioned by the Trump administration over allegations of aiding the drug trade, ordered his nation's security forces to immediately suspend intelligence sharing with the U.S. until the boat strikes cease.
That is an astonishing operational failure for the U.S. military. I mean, if the mission is counter-narcotics, how vital is Colombian intelligence?
It's absolutely vital. A former U.S. ambassador explicitly noted that Colombia provides an estimated 85% of all actionable intelligence used by the U.S. to counter narcotics smuggling in the region.
85%. So without this information flow, the U.S. military is essentially blind to ground-level operations, transport hubs, and cartel movements in the source country of most of the cocaine and heroin flowing north.
Yes. The entire counter-narcotics premise of the operation is severely hampered by its own tactics.
And President Petro's stance is remarkably nuanced. He's strongly criticizing the U.S. actions, but he's not doing so to embrace Maduro.
That nuance is key. Petro called Trump a barbarian for the lethal tactics, but maintained a highly critical view of the Venezuelan leader, stating, "I believe there has been no legitimate leadership in Venezuela for some time."
So he's challenging the U.S. on human rights grounds regarding the boat strikes.
He is. He's insisting that intelligence sharing would only continue if U.S. agencies guarantee the intelligence won't be used in actions that jeopardize human rights, a guarantee the current administration is seemingly unwilling to give.
And this isolation extends across the Atlantic, too. How are European allies responding to this unilateral military escalation and the threat of war?
The international backlash is broad and significant. Germany and Switzerland, for instance, issued joint calls urging a peaceful bilateral settlement. The German Foreign Minister, Johann Wedeful, publicly emphasized that they are counting on both sides to recognize that the issue needs to be resolved through a good bilateral agreement.
And the language used by the Swiss Foreign Minister was particularly pointed.
Yes. Swiss Foreign Minister Ignacio Cassis stated very pointedly, "I believe it is in everyone's interest to prevent another war from breaking out." The term "another war" signifies that U.S. allies view this confrontation not as a simple drug interdiction effort, but as having the potential to spiral into a major, destabilizing regional conflict.
And what about the UK and France?
Well, the United Kingdom began limiting some intelligence sharing with the U.S. over concerns that the boat strikes contravene in international law, and France openly condemned the U.S. military operations in the Caribbean as a violation of international law.
So even a regional neighbor like Mexico, seeing the strikes off its coast in the Eastern Pacific, took preemptive measures.
Precisely. Mexico, facing the prospect of U.S. strikes in its operational vicinity, agreed to step up cooperation by using its own navy to intercept suspected drug boats in international waters. This move was clearly designed to avoid further U.S. strikes near the Mexican coast. It really demonstrates the regional fear of the U.S.'s unilateral and lethal tactics.
So while the U.S. is facing this international backlash, Venezuela is actively making it clear that if the U.S. moves from coercion to intervention, it will face a military response. Let's look closer at Venezuela's deterrent posture, particularly their air defenses, which are now heavily Russian-supported.
Right. Venezuela has displayed its readiness with drills involving its mixed fleet of F-16 and Russian Su-30 Mk2 fighter jets. However, the real deterrent is its layered anti-accessoria denial, or A2AD, capability, which has been rapidly built up through recent Russian deliveries.
What specifically are the technical capabilities of these Russian systems they are deploying?
We're seeing footage confirming the deployment of several sophisticated Russian systems. This includes the TR-M2E short-range SAM systems. The TOR is highly mobile and it's effective against precision-guided munitions and tactical aircraft. Technically, the TR-M2E can detect and track up to 48 targets simultaneously and engage 4 threats at once within a 15-kilometer radius.
And they have others, too.
Yes. They're also utilizing the Buck M2E medium-range system and the short-to-medium-range Panzer S-1, all of which were confirmed delivered via Russian transport aircraft.
So Venezuela isn't relying on one large, vulnerable air defense system. They are building a layered system that is designed to complicate U.S. air operations at multiple altitude bands.
Exactly. These systems are highly mobile and are designed to operate independently of centralized command, making them extremely difficult to suppress in a coordinated fashion. The goal is to contest U.S. airspace superiority at low to mid-altitude bands near Venezuelan territory, thus raising the risk for U.S. pilots and costly assets.
And what is the consensus from military analysts looking at this?
The consensus is clear. Venezuela's military is not equipped for a conventional, sustained fight against the U.S., but that is not their plan.
So if a conventional fight is impossible, what are they preparing for?
They are preparing for a protracted guerrilla campaign, an insurgency. Analysts warn that while the U.S. could swiftly defeat the regular Venezuelan military and occupy the country, the follow-on resistance would be fierce, decentralized, and protracted. David Smiled, a Tulane professor, noted that the U.S. simply does not have the manpower in the region, even with the carrier, for a full-scale invasion force required for occupation and stabilization.
So any attempt at occupation would likely make the conflict very ugly, quickly resembling the costly and unpopular insurgencies we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Exactly. The Russian support, therefore, is not aimed at helping Venezuela win an air war. It is aimed at guaranteeing the U.S. loses the subsequent ground war.
That's the strategic calculus.
It is. The sophisticated air defenses guarantee the U.S. pays a high price for any initial strikes, and the subsequent insurgency guarantees a high political cost that will likely turn into a forever war, much like we've seen in the Middle East. It would tie up U.S. resources and damage global credibility.
Finally, let's consider the internal dynamics within Venezuela itself. The humanitarian and economic crisis under Maduro is profound, rampant inflation, poverty, food insecurity. How does the Venezuelan public feel about the threat of foreign intervention?
It's a highly complex and fragmented picture. On one hand, there is immense, justified fear among the population, especially as Maduro has cracked down on dissent and free speech since the tensions escalated, with reports of journalists being detained. Any conflict would exacerbate the humanitarian crisis exponentially.
And on the other hand?
On the other hand, sources indicate some Venezuelans are described as feeling a small, desperate sense of excitement. Despite the risk of war, they hold a quiet, desperate hope that American action, even military action, could succeed in removing the widely unpopular Maduro regime. They are, in essence, caught between the ambitions of foreign powers, a dictator they despise, and a deeply uncertain, violent future.
This brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've synthesized the sources revealing the two vastly conflicting narratives driving this crisis: the highly visible, overwhelming U.S. military presence and the invisible, complex geopolitical and domestic motives.
And we can draw 5 essential takeaways from the source material you provided, which really summarize the immense stakes of this confrontation.
Okay, number one. The U.S. has mobilized one of the most powerful carrier strike groups in decades, the USS Gerald R. and its Tomahawk armed escorts, positioning itself within easy striking distance of Caracas. This deployment is explicitly aimed at projecting coercive force and preparing military options for regime change.
Number 2, the stated mission, Operation Southern Spear and counter-narcotics, is severely undermined by factual data. Venezuela is a marginal contributor to the U.S. drug epidemic. 0.000% of the vital lethal drug fentanyl comes from the region, making the stated objective dubious at best and serving primarily as a political cover for deeper military intentions.
Number 3. The real drivers are immense, multifaceted pressure points. The lure of accessing the world's largest oil reserves, the explicit revival of the Monroe Doctrine to assert dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and the need to counter provocative Russian and growing Chinese influence in the region.
Number 4, international and regional blowback is profound. The unilateral approach has isolated the U.S., most notably through the suspension of 85% of actionable intelligence by key ally Colombia. This critically hinders any legitimate counter-narcotics effort while simultaneously alienating European allies.
And finally, number 5. Venezuela is actively preparing for a costly, decentralized guerrilla resistance. This preparation, supported by recent Russian air defense deliveries, the Pantsir Buk TOR M2E, exponentially raises the risk profile of any invasion, threatening to turn a quick strike into a drawn-out, economically and politically debilitating forever war.
Right. So the U.S. administration, by deploying credible, high-end force like the USS Ford, aims for a swift, coercive outcome. The ideal scenario being that Maduro simply crumbles under the pressure. But given the scale of the deployment and the open military support from Russia, which guarantees that force will be met with severe, lasting resistance, this confrontation is a fundamental test of coercive diplomacy. You must ask, if coercive diplomacy relies entirely on the credible threat of force, and Russia has given Maduro the means to guarantee that force will be met with severe, lasting resistance, what sources suggest the administration can successfully exit this confrontation without either major conflict or catastrophic loss of credibility? The scale of the military posturing today ensures that failure would be catastrophic, not just for Venezuela, but for regional stability and U.S. foreign policy credibility in the Western Hemisphere for decades to come. That is the true cost of this escalating crisis.